Some of the things that we wanted to show just to begin with, right? And I would like a volunteer if someone wants to come up and just kind of let me push them around on the plates. So yeah, kind of hop on, Marty. And again, if you haven't seen our software, haven't seen the plates, right? When we talk about forces, and I think Dr. Rose did a great job of this yesterday as he talks about the different forces and torques that we can experience in the swing. So if we think about Marty kind of creating some lateral force, if I push some resistance here and Marty starts to push on me this way, okay? We kind of see some positions here. If you did a situation where you maybe try and spread your push with both feet, kind of, yeah. And we can see this visually with the 3D force vectors on top. What does that mean in terms of kind of him applying forces in different directions? You see the reaction force coming up and kind of tilting in between each other. We could see him move all of his force towards his left leg. Okay, perfect. We could see him kind of bounce around this way. I could create a scenario where maybe I'm going to apply some resistance here and Marty's going to try and turn against me. Okay, again, kind of try and turn against me.
Which way?
So you're going to try and twist, like you're doing a little bit of a downswing here. And now I can see those kind of graphs kind of tilt this way as we get those AP forces rocking and some of that vertical torque. Okay, we could do a little bit of a jump. So jump up and jump towards me a little bit, right? We can see a vertical force curve going up and down as he creates a vertical force up and down in his motion as well. Okay, thanks, Marty. You're awesome. I'm going to walk you through a lot of the data in my presentation, so I think we'll see more of exactly how things are displayed in the app. Again, we obviously have some of you who are users, some who use force plates, but maybe not our software, which is great. So what I wanted to talk about was impulse. And again, I feel like Dr. Rose kind of set this up a little bit yesterday as we think about this idea of people who are close to the wall, people who are far away from the wall, and how they can kind of create an impulse. And I think of impulse as really the motion generator over that period of time. Okay, so over this time period that we might look at in a swing, how much impulse we get can really help create motion. It can improve body mechanics. It can definitely improve club delivery as we put the body in these different positions. And so I always like to start out, if you've been in a presentation I've had, you know that I have lots of children. These are all of my children, all 6 of them. Okay? And as time goes, if you have multiple children, yes, you love them all, but you definitely have a favorite at different times, just ones that you like better than other ones, and I think that's okay. And it's the same for me with my children, and it's definitely the same for the forces and torques that I look at in the golf swing. So we could look at things like AP force. This is my 4-year-old Knox. AP force, it's cool, it's great. I don't know if it's my most favorite one right now. We've got Hazel, she's lateral force, and lateral force typically is like one of my most favorite forces of all time. They've got a cute little dimple, they're really sweet. It's not quite my favorite one right now. She's great though. I've got kinetic sequence, the kinetic sequence which we talked about a lot with how we cue up these forces, right, the timings of them. Again, pretty neat, right? Beckham's a pretty neat, interesting kid, but it's not number 1 right now, okay? I've got vertical force. We love vertical force, right? I think we tend to gravitate towards that explosive movement of that player at the end of the swing, and we just, I love vertical force. This is my son, Lucas. You saw his swing yesterday with in Dr. Rose's presentation. We've got a little bit of work to do on that. And then you've got vertical torque, right? So, or this rotational or this twisting motion that we talked about yesterday. This is Kate. Kate is wonderful. I love the rotation. I love the twists of the swing. We'll look at a little bit of that data today. But my most favorite current thing I'm looking at right now is impulse. Okay, and this is my youngest son, Jude. If you've had like a 2.5-year-old who's a really good sleeper, a really good eater, and naps well, I mean, he's asleep for 15 hours of the day. I don't know how he can't be my favorite, right? And this is us just in Utah, right? We're fortunate to have a pretty place that we live as well. And again, a beautiful country here. Again, a pleasure to be here as I look at kind of the faces in the back. I definitely think there's a kind of a one of these things is not like the other. And I feel like sometimes I'm the one that's not like the other. So I've learned a lot from these coaches and experts. I'm excited to share with you some of the things that I'm looking at in my lab at Utah Valley University, and also a lot of the research I've been doing with Smart to Move. So when we kind of talk about how we help improve forces and torques and motion, which is where my expertise is. So I'll make it very clearly known. I'm not a golf coach. I would say that I'm a force and motion expert. And I've done different sports, and golf is kind of where my passion lies and where I'm gravitating towards. So I'm looking at things just from if I look at the motion and force of a player, how can I improve their motion? And then if their body's hanging onto a club, what's that going to then do to the potential for a club to be delivered in certain ways? And so we tend to kind of look at this performance pie order of correction where we can kind of check these boxes of what's the magnitude of the force being applied, how large is that force, what's the point of application, or where is that force being applied, the timing of that force, when in the swing are these forces peaking and growing and shrinking. And then the last one is this shape of the curve. And shape of the curve is the one that just feels a little bit not quite as specific, I'll say. And when I think of shape of the curve, I think of things like rate of force development, how quickly a golfer might rev up the engine of force. I for sure think of the impulse, which is this time component of force, which I think is a key part of what we look at in ground reaction force curves. So the equation for impulse is a simple one. It's just you take the amount of force a player applies, you multiply it by time, and you get a measurement of impulse. So it's over a quantity of time. So instead of just looking at, hey, my peak magnitude of vertical force is 175% of body weight, well, I may want to look at how that player grows their force to 175% of body weight. Do they get there quickly and stay there for a long time? Do they just all of a sudden, it takes a long time in the swing and then they kind of shoot up at the last moment? The reason why we care so much about impulse is this second equation, which is that impulse is equal to momentum. The equation for momentum is mass and velocity. And I've never worked with a golfer who can make themselves larger in terms of mass just by applying force. So if they're not changing the mass in that equation, then they have to be changing the velocity. It's that quantity of motion they're changing over that time period. And so that's something that I'm really diving into a lot in my lab on the 3D force plates as I look at different impulse measurements and try and find out what's meaningful as it relates to impulse. So when we think of impulse, we can think about it kind of 4 different ways, at least if we're looking at the data that we get from the Smart to Move plates. We can talk about lateral impulses, vertical torque, or Dr. Rose talked about this as our twisting motion. We could talk about AP forces and then vertical forces. And I like to think about it just from the concept of what do these things do in terms of motion. Okay, so if we're talking about lateral impulse, we are talking about motion towards and away from the target. Okay, this is that player's motion. If you're looking at their center of mass, what kind of quantity of motion do they have towards and away from the target? This also has a strong influence on our frontal plane or our kind of rock and roll type motion that we talked about yesterday. This is going to be a big player in that as well. Okay, the other one we can talk about is our vertical torque. This is our twisting motion, that rotational motion. And again, the amount of impulse we have in this area is going to influence the quantity of motion we have in rotation for our body. Okay, we can talk about AP forces, and we know those AP forces tie into the vertical torque. This is how we create it, or create that twisting motion. But this is also going to create the quantity of motion that a player has towards and away from the ball during that time period. And then the last one would be the vertical. And the vertical would be the impulse that's related to that motion towards and away from the ground during that time period. Again, this will also influence some of those moment arms of that frontal plane torque as well. Okay, so this is how I kind of start to think about it. What does it do to the body? What does it do to the center of mass just from a general motion standpoint? Okay. Now, in terms of kind of impulse and motion, one of the things that I like to look at a lot with impulse and motion is this concept of, well, how much negative quantity of motion are they creating over a time period? How much positive motion are they creating over a time period? And then for that same time period, a value that I'm starting to look at a lot is just this idea that's called net impulse. So here's kind of a really basic example here with a player. If I'm looking at this twisting torque, and I'm just looking at it from start of swing to impact. And we know the start of the swing is going to create some quantity of motion or turn away from the target, and then some quantity of motion turned back towards the target. And I can just take those measurements. This player, for example, had a quantity of motion of negative 9.6 away. That was their impulse measurement. They had a positive 27, which gives them a net value of positive 17.3. I've just taken the positive and subtracted out the negative. And I start to understand, at least for the entirety of swing, does he have more quantity of motion towards and rotation towards the ball and target, or rotation away? And how long does that last? Okay? And so this is something I'll talk about a lot today, is this idea of a net impulse over a time period. Okay, now what else does impulse influence? And I want to make sure that I'm clear on this, and that I think there are a lot of ways to create different types of club delivery, things that we might measure on a monitor like TrackMan. But I also am starting to see some relationships, which I think that those who are kind of diving into forces and torques are seeing these relationships. So these are just a few of the relationships that I've seen. And again, lots of ways to kind of influence this, but I find that when I can help players improve the way they're creating lateral impulses, I have the potential to help them with things like low point and attack angle. When I think about their center of mass moving towards and away from the target, well, where does the low point end up? Okay, I can start to think about things like a swing direction. If this is something that's going to help influence some of that rock and roll type motion, can that help some of that kind of shallow to steep type move versus a steep to shallow move that, again, Dr. Rose talked about yesterday? And then, of course, swing speed. Impulse is always going to be something that's related to swing speed and power. When I think about vertical torque and AP forces, I can think about, again, swing speed is up there as well. I can think about things like the club face itself in terms of kind of opening and closing, maybe even some of the heel to toe type impacts that we would see if I think about the center of mass moving towards and away from the ball. And then with a vertical impulse, again, swing speed would be something that I would look at a lot. Low points, attack angles. These are just some parameters that I think we're often used to seeing in TrackMan, and then the associated ball flights that come, and at least start to understand some of the impulses that we would look at if we saw maybe some issues with ball flight related to some of these things that you would measure using a launch monitor. Okay? Now, when I think of impulse, I think in the equation, right? We've got force, we've got time. So we can influence impulse by creating more force, or we can influence impulse by creating that force over a better, longer time. And so the example I have, if you've flown recently, you think of these long runways at airports that are about 3,000 meters long, and you compare that to an aircraft carrier that's about 900 meters long. Well, from a time standpoint, it's going to be a lot harder to stop on an aircraft carrier than it is to stop on a runway. So what do they do on aircraft carriers? They have to rev up the force as much as they possibly can. So cable systems that help grab the airplanes, kind of reverse thrusted engines that are really helping to maximize the force, because that's their only option to stop this airplane from falling off the end of the aircraft carrier. And so that'd be an example where you are pushed into having to use the force component of the impulse equation. Whereas when I land at a regular airfield, I have a little bit longer time to apply those forces. Okay? So here's kind of an example of two players. Okay? And this is lateral impulse that we're looking at with two players. So the yellow curve, to orient you, this is the total lateral force produced by the player. Anytime this yellow line kind of runs above this zero here, that would be positive force, indicating a quantity of motion towards the target or a stopping of the motion away from the target. We do both of those things. And you can see that these players, interestingly enough, the player on the left actually has a slightly lower peak than the player on the right. So a peak of 11% body weight versus a peak of 13% body weight. But there's a very different shape of the curve. If you look at the one on the right, you can see, I would describe it as a little bit more of kind of a peak to like a mountain that's a little bit higher. And the one on the left feels like they kind of build up and it kind of shallows off a little bit of more of a plain, or I don't know, a rounded hill. And if you start looking at this kind of shaded yellow region under the curve, well, the player on the left actually produces twice as much impulse as the player on the right over the same time period. And the time period here was the backswing. So start of swing to club change of direction at the top. You can see that the player on the right, while they don't produce as much force, because they build it earlier and hang on to it longer, they're getting more quantity of motion towards the target during this time period, to the tune of over 2 times the quantity of motion, even though their magnitude was the same. So this would be a scenario where if I want this player to increase their impulse, they're going to catch up to this player not by producing a larger kind of peak of that hill. That could be something they could do. But I want to see how I can figure out how to get them shifted up earlier in that backswing, building more lateral force earlier in the backswing.